everybody, I'm Nicole Vulcan. I'm the editor of The Source Weekly. And why don't you introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Schaier, and I am running to be your next Deschutes County Sheriff. So a little bit about myself real fast. First and foremost, the absolute most important thing is I'm a father and I'm a husband. I have twins that are 5 years old. We've raised them here in Bend, and we moved here about 7 years ago from the Las Vegas area and haven't looked back ever since. It's been an amazing experience for us. And in that time, I've had the opportunity to work with the Bend Police Department over the last 7 years. And once again, been just an amazing experience being part of that organization. And I want to thank you for allowing us to sit down today and have a conversation and answer any questions you have and any questions that your viewers may have. And I appreciate you allowing me to take my mask off. We're outside and we're distanced enough that we can do that, so I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, nobody needs to see my face, but getting to know you is the important part here. So why don't you tell people why you're running for sheriff?
Absolutely. So, like I said, my family and I, we've been here for the last 7 years, and in that time, what I've noticed and then what I've just learned from my experience being here is the culture of the sheriff's office is just completely broken. And I feel like it's been like that for quite some time. For those of you who may or may not know, we haven't had a outside of the sheriff's office sheriff in our community in almost 20 years now. And I think it's very important that we give ourselves the opportunity to think outside the box and approach things from just a different perspective. So I'm looking to be the sheriff who becomes the accessible sheriff to our community, who answers to every constituent within our entire county, not just the ones that make it convenient or easy to talk to for myself. I want to bring innovation and technology to the sheriff's office. They're operating with systems that are dated back to the 1980s, and I think it's just not fair to the community to have that burden when the most amazing technology in our profession exists today that makes us more efficient, more fiscally responsible, and just better able to serve the community. And then I think that there's a disconnect between what law enforcement currently is as a society, the way that we view things, and I think it's time that we renegotiate the social contract and see how we do things differently in law enforcement and give back to the community in ways that we've never attempted before.
That's certainly a conversation right now across the board. So one of my first questions, really, you sort of touched on already, was diving into a critique of the current sheriff's office. What needs to be improved specifically? I don't know if you want to add anything else.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think some of the issues that we're seeing is lack of transparency and accountability. There was, specific incidences. I think most of us are familiar with the pursuit that Sheriff Nelson was involved in back in 2019 on Highway 97 that ultimately led to an individual who was suicidal, crashing into a Bend police car, injuring him and his canine partner. And the event itself, which obviously most of us have seen that video and is pretty scary at times. The concern for me, not necessarily is the actions of Sheriff Nelson in that pursuit, it's what happened after the fact. Sheriff Nelson never held himself accountable. Any one of his deputies would have been reprimanded, rightfully so, for participating in an event like that. We never saw any disciplinary action held against himself. We never saw any statement really made, and no ownership of the mistakes that actually were made during that. And I'm actually, to take it even a little bit further, in a deposition that Sheriff Nelson was involved in, he actually said that the policies of his office do not apply to him because he's the sheriff. And to me, that's just like leadership 101. We can't do as I say, not as I do. I mean, I'm a parent. If I did that with my kids, it wouldn't work out too well. So one of the things that I would bring back to the sheriff's office is, as your sheriff, I would hold myself 100% accountable to every policy that the sheriff's office expects their own deputies to follow. So I think transparency and accountability in that sense is one issue. There's some fiscal concerns. I think that because there's a significant lack of cooperation with the sheriff's office currently and other law enforcement agencies in Central Oregon, we're seeing that hundreds of thousands of dollars are being spent to create identical teams. I specifically talk about the SWAT team. Central Oregon has a Central Oregon-wide emergency response team that includes agencies from all over the Tri-County area. Every single agency is represented on that team except for one, and that's the sheriff's office. And they have elected to have their own tactical team. And to me, that speaks volumes to two different things: the inability or the unwillingness to work with your partners in the area. And I think collaboration is the only way we're ever going to be successful. And then secondly, just costing the taxpayers that much additional money to provide similar services. So I think there's a lot of things that are ways that we can just readdress the budget, we can readjust the structure of the agency. The undersheriff hasn't been in office for years at the agency. I think that's a vital position for an agency of this size. So that's another thing I would bring back as well. So those are just a few of the things that I think that needs to be addressed at the sheriff's office, just to make it work more efficiently for everyone in the community.
So there's lots going on with police reform, or the conversations around police reform. So I have a couple questions related to that. Do you think it's the sheriff's job to meet with activist groups, and why would you or would you not engage with activist groups in the community?
So absolutely, without question, that is your almost only job. When you're an elected official, I mean, we look at the position of sheriff. That is the only law enforcement officer in the entire county that we chose. Every other law enforcement officer, to include chiefs of police and superintendents, are appointed by city councilors or county commissions. So this is the only law enforcement professional that we as a community said, we want you. So to not want to engage with your community members, whether you're going to see eye to eye on every topic or not, is just completely irresponsible in my opinion. So I've had the opportunity to meet with a lot of our current activist groups in town, and I've approached those conversations with an empathetic ear. If you sit down and immediately judge the person sitting across the table from you as we're not going to agree on things, you're automatically going to shut yourself out, and you're going to miss opportunities to potentially find that middle ground, which is all anyone in our community wants to find. We all want to be heard. We want to have our concerns thoughtfully addressed. And yes, we're not going to see eye to eye on every topic, and we're not going to agree on every solution, but you have to be able to put yourself out there, like I said, listen empathetically, try to understand their perspective and what it is that they're trying to accomplish for the community, and work closely with one another. So that's something that I would absolutely do if I were your sheriff.
Yeah. Obviously, another big one is the topic of defunding the police,
Yes.
which most people have come to realize doesn't actually mean that.
Correct.
What's your take on the reallocation of resources that is
Yes.
really part of that conversation?
And I appreciate rewording it that way, because yes, the hashtag is terrible. I believe that there's this misconception that defunding the police means we're going to get rid of law enforcement. What our law enforcement members at the sheriff's office and every other agency in our county do for our community is incredible. They're an amazing group of people, and we need to give back so that way they can get back doing to what it is they do. So my stance on the concept of reallocating funding is I support the idea. And I support the idea because law enforcement forever, I shouldn't say forever, for the last few decades has been expected to fix all of society's problems. And it's unrealistic and it's not sustainable. And I think that's where we're finally starting to see come into a head a little bit. So one of the things that I value in the concept of reallocating funds is, once again, collaboratively, we have to treat public safety as a group effort. It's not just law enforcement. So we need to give back to social workers. We need to give back to homeless nonprofits and other groups like that out there. We have to give back to education, to the environment, because I think if we actually reapproach and relook at the way that we're spending our money for public safety, by giving to social workers and giving back to mental health professionals who can respond to those types of incidences, it in turn is going to drop the volume of calls that law enforcement is now responsible for, so we can actually go out and be in your neighborhoods. We can be proactive. We can use technology to know where the crimes are happening, when they're happening, when the fatal car accidents are happening, creating a traffic team to be out there to actually keep you safe on the road. So I think there's a lot of value to getting law enforcement back to what it is we do well, and that's investigating criminal activity and preventing crimes from occurring, hopefully before they happen. So the only way we're gonna ever achieve that is if we sit down at the table with our partners in the community and understand who takes what role and how we can assist each other in that. But I completely support the idea of looking at just the way we've done things.
You brought up technology. There's been some talk and perhaps some resistance in the sheriff's department around the idea of body cams for the sheriff's department. Do you support or oppose them?
I support body cams. The concept of body cams are fantastic. They're not the end all be all, right? It's a two-dimensional view of a three-dimensional world. So they are not going to solve all of the issues that law enforcement may or may not perceivably have. But they're an amazing tool in getting back to being transparent. They're an amazing tool to hold people accountable, to both hold officers accountable as well as the community that we're interacting with. So I absolutely support the idea. It's a huge cost issue right now because of the way you have to store the video. But I think that is a priority that the office needs to look at. And once again, going back to reallocating funding and prioritizing your funding in a different manner, I think we can get there.
You talked a little bit about transparency and accountability. I want to bring that up again. What can the sheriff do to foster accountability and transparency as it pertains to discipline of deputies or others?
Absolutely. So I think there's a few things we can do. I think the internal affairs process right now, specifically at Deschutes County Sheriff's Office, to me is completely broken. We're seeing deputies put on administrative leave for months up to years, where they're getting paid their full wages, their full benefits to sit at home and not provide a service back to the community. We as taxpayers are paying for that deputy to sit there at their house. And I think that there are ways that we can better, I don't want to say streamline because that would allude to not doing it thoroughly, but prioritizing it differently to where we are actually going to make sure we complete these investigations in a timely manner. We are going to be open about what the investigations are within legal ways that we can. But shortening that process, I think, is a way that we're going to hold ourselves accountable more, and we're not going to cost taxpayers thousands and thousands of dollars by just letting these things stream out, waiting at times for just people's retirements to come up and then say, oh, well, now they're retired, so this investigation is completed. And I also think it goes back to one of the reasons that I really see a ton of value in the undersheriff position is I think what we're seeing currently at the sheriff's office is without having that second person, not only do you not have succession planning built into your agency, but you're also making the sheriff responsible for day-to-day operations. And I don't believe that that's the sheriff's responsibility. I think that's something of the undersheriff and their command staff that they have to trust are doing the right thing. And then that allows the sheriff to actually build those relationships, like we mentioned earlier, with the activist groups, with the business community, with the education community, the different partners inside and outside of law enforcement. So I think that's one way that will also be more transparent, is that if I'm lucky enough to be elected your sheriff, I'll be the one who's out there in the community actually engaging, having these conversations, having these opportunities to learn from one another, because I'm going to reallocate appropriately to make sure that the day-to-day is still being ran efficiently and successfully. But I think that's one way that we're also going to be able to be more transparent, is just being out in the public and open to answering questions, even when they're hard questions and you don't necessarily like the answer.
Yeah, so speaking of that too, the Deschutes County Sheriff's office has 3 open cases for investigation and professional standards on file with the state. Bend PD doesn't have any right now. Are there elements of the department that are dysfunctional and what can be improved? And of course, knowing that I crafted this question before you started talking.
Oh yes, of course. No, I mean, I think what we touched on earlier, there's a lot of things that just need to be addressed. I think the concept, I've been saying this, the fact that we haven't had an outside sheriff in 20 years, I think, is a major concern. Our community has changed drastically in the last 20 years. Even the last 7 years that I've been here, it's changed. The demographic has changed dramatically. So I think the issue that we're seeing is when we continuously promote the same type of sheriff or the same resume or the same experience, we're getting the exact same results. Nothing has changed. You mentioned earlier about some of the concerns that other local law enforcement agencies aren't dealing with. There's been 10, since Sheriff Nelson has taken over, as of March of this year, there's been 10 official grievances filed against his office from his own association. Bend PD and Redmond PD have had none in that same time frame. There's been countless lawsuits. I think most of us are familiar with the federal lawsuits the Sheriff's Office has right now. And then also the morale in a recent survey was at an all-time low. 70% of their staff said that there was a major morale problem inside their office, and nothing has been done to address it. So I think the ways that we increase morale, which in turn ultimately, I believe, makes people want to be there and is going to hold themselves a little bit more accountable. So in my opinion, the accountability piece, when you're only holding people accountable and there's nothing else to support that, all you're doing is leading with fear and intimidation, and you're not going to get the best out of your employees. So leading by example and creating a culture where everyone has buy-in, where everyone is a part of creating what that culture is. Another thing that needs to be addressed that hasn't been a staple in their organization for 16 years now has been a strategic plan. Not to be facetious, but I don't understand how you operate an agency of 240 members and almost a $50 million budget and you do not have a plan in place. They haven't had a strategic plan since 2004. So for me, that's another factor that if no one knows where we're going, no one knows what our goals are, or truly what our mission is, it's really hard to get that buy-in. and then in turn makes it even that much more difficult to hold people accountable if no one knows what we're being held accountable to. So I think those are a few other things, as earlier to what I mentioned, that we can address at the Sheriff's Office.
So that makes me think of you're coming out of working for Ben PD. The previous chief implemented some programs that have been fairly well received, I would say.
Yes.
Do you want to comment at all about just things you might bring that you've learned from Ben PD over there if you're elected?
Absolutely. So you're absolutely right. Chief Porter, who we were unbelievably honored to earn his endorsement for our campaign. It was an incredible endorsement. What he did for our agency and the way he increased our morale was a lot of things I just mentioned. The accountability piece, holding himself to the same standard that he holds his staff to, but probably the most effective tool and implementation he had was the wellness program. So that's something I'm extremely passionate about. That's something we'll bring to the Sheriff's Office immediately, and it'll be completely comprehensive, both physical and mental wellness. One of the biggest struggles in our profession is mental health. We have never been trained how to deal with trauma, yet we deal with it every single shift, whether it's direct or vicarious. And I think that one of the issues that we see is we have high divorce rate, we have high substance abuse rates in our profession, we have life expectancy is only 5 years after doing this profession for 30 years. So a lot of the things that we have just always dealt with as, well, suck it up, it's what you signed up for, is no longer healthy, and it's a major recruiting tool to use, having a wellness program, and it's a major retention tool. It costs well over $100,000 to replace a deputy in our community. So we can implement a wellness program to make sure that we're retaining people so they feel valued and they're actually getting the help they need. And it's not just an email that gets sent out from the sheriff that says, hey, if you're ever feeling sad, here's a few psychologists you can call. We will actually have an in-house psychologist in our office that people can interact with and get referrals from. We'll provide yoga, on-duty workouts, and one of the other big factors that I think is going to make the office healthier is the way that their current schedule is structured. So we're going to address the structure of the schedule to make it healthier for the actual staff members, but also provide different overlap coverage so we're actually in our community more than we currently are.
Interesting. The Sheriff's Office currently they found some creative ways to support people without homes, working to host the warming shelter this year, offering space for the Veterans Village. How do you see the Sheriff's Office helping out with those social issues is related to the work of the department?
Oh, absolutely. I think how we talked about it earlier in the idea of just, refiguring and renegotiating that social structure, that social contract. And law enforcement needs to look outside of necessarily always just law enforcement and what can we do to be better partners. We may not lead that effort, but can we be a supportive partner in it? I'm happy that we now have the Stabilization Center. That was a tremendous opportunity for our community. I've personally used that place for interactions I've had with community members, and it's a great facility. The staff over there is second to none. So I'm really excited that we're moving in the right direction with that. And then yes, there are some creative ways that we can use our facilities or some of our resources to give back, whether it's to education, to the houselessness problem, to mental health, whatever the case may be. But we have to be an active member at every single table when it comes to just improving the quality of life of our community and play a role, whatever range of importance, I guess, that role would be, even if it's just to be a support and to have another, listening ear in the room to throw out ideas. But the Sheriff's Office and law enforcement in general has to become more community driven and be a part of the overall health of our entire community, not just focusing necessarily on law enforcement.
I want to talk a little bit about the jail. Philosophically, knowing it's a county jail and that's not necessarily where people go for a whole long time, is the jail an opportunity for punishment or rehabilitation in your mind?
It has to be rehabilitation. We have to be able to provide services. The concept and the idea, like you mentioned philosophically, is we want individuals who find themselves in a tough place, who've committed harm against our community or against one of their loved ones, to be held accountable and to make sure that they're going to continuously victimize the community. But while they're there, we have to give them resources so that way when they are done with their time at the county jail, they can now be productive members of society again, whether that's addiction services that we provide, mental health services. I'm saddened to say that there's only currently, it just recently increased to 2 mental health professionals in the entire jail. Obviously, COVID numbers have changed, but traditionally there's about 300 inmates at any given time. And in just my personal experience, a vast majority of those individuals are suffering from some sort of mental health concern or addiction. So we have to be able to provide better mental health services inside the jail, because I don't want to see another person kill themselves inside the jail. In the last 5 years, we've had 3 people now die inside of our jail, and it's just completely unacceptable. Those are preventable things if we have the right resources in there.
I wanted to talk a little bit about COVID as it relates to the jail. Obviously, we're still in the middle of this wonderful pandemic.
Yes.
What's your take on the limiting of the numbers in the jail and how that might be impacting the wider community?
You know what? The way that it's currently structured, I agree with what the sheriff's office's decision ultimately was. And I also agree with the idea that we don't necessarily always have to think of jail as our first step, right? When we interact with community members who've made mistakes, who need to be held accountable, it's not always a direct ticket to jail. I think there's ways that we can look at things, whether it's people being charged with minor drug charges or people being charged with property crime. I think that there's ways that we can gear people to stay necessarily aware, to not always necessarily go straight to jail, and bring them to other services that are once again going to help with that rehabilitation, and to make sure that people are productive members once again in our community, yet still respecting and appreciating the victims and making sure that they get the justice that they deserve. So I don't disagree. I like the idea of we got to keep our community safe. I will say that there have been a few incidences where, if COVID was not a factor, that individuals in our community who probably rightfully should have been jailed should have gone to jail. And I'm sad to see a few incidences that I'm aware of that this COVID concern has prevented that from happening.
What's your personal take on Oregon's sanctuary law?
So I support the idea, and the reason I support it in my capacity as a law enforcement officer. So I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona. I started my career in Las Vegas, Nevada, both of those communities with a very high Latinx population. So a lot of my friends, family, neighbors that I've grown up have been from that community, and I have nothing but amazing examples of how they are as neighbors and family and friends and peers and coworkers. When I moved to Oregon, I was excited to be a part of an organization, or excuse me, as a state that supported their immigrant population. And going back to my position regarding law enforcement, local law enforcement's role is to build trust and build relationships with their community members, with all community members. I don't care if you're a resident of our community, I don't care if you're a visitor of our community, I don't care if you're commuting from another neighboring town to work here, I don't care what your immigration status is. To me, local law enforcement's role is to build trust and to build community with every single individual in our county. With that being said, if we are intentionally cooperating with any entity, specifically ICE, but any entity that is ultimately going to break trust with a certain sect of our population, that is not the role of local law enforcement. What the time I saw in my experience in Las Vegas is that the communities that were undocumented, it was very challenging for them to call us when they needed help. They were scared to call when they were victims of crime. And I do not ever want to see any group or any person in our community continuously victimized and not be able to feel confident in their local law enforcement to reach out for help. So my stance as a law enforcement officer is I support the idea of not cooperating voluntarily. Now, we will cooperate if there's active warrants and there are people in our community who are posing threats to us and our neighbors. We will absolutely support in that capacity with warrants and whatnot that are signed by actual judges for criminal activity, not just detainers for deportation concerns. But that's my stance, that we have to build trust, and the only way we're going to do that is to actually let people feel confident that they can call their sheriff's office and know that we're there to help them.
So I've been thinking about this line of, this is in relation to the recent ICE activity in our community about the information that ICE gleans from local law enforcement databases or from jails. And I know there can be a proactive kind of supplying of that information from local law enforcement to ICE. And I don't know what my question is around that. More just like, what is your take on that and how that information gets shared?
So like I said earlier, we're gonna support our federal law enforcement when they actually have active warrants for people's arrest in our community. As your sheriff, I will not voluntarily give up information. One practice that the sheriff's office currently does is every single morning they send what's called an ICE report to the local ICE branch. And with that, it's any individual who is currently undocumented that is sitting inside their jail. And it doesn't matter what type of crime they're sitting inside the jail for, they are voluntarily sharing that information with the local ICE office. And we have seen and heard multiple incidences where ICE just happens to be in the sheriff's parking lot when the release time is, and they happen to run into an individual and say, hey, we're here for you. And to me, once again, that erodes trust. So one thing that I will stop is that current practice of voluntarily supplying information with the local ICE office.
Yeah, that to me that sounds according to the law like detection or apprehension, or participating in detection or
I have
apprehension.
looked into it extensively, and I think it's very gray. Unfortunately, I don't think it's necessarily a black and white response in that. But I just personally don't think it's the ethical decision to make. And once again, it just breaks that trust that we need to constantly be trying to earn.
So I'm almost done.
No,
Going to give
please.
you a chance to talk about anything you want to talk about. Last one is the painful one, perhaps.
I understand.
There was an incident involving you and a fatal shooting.
Yes.
Anything you want to comment upon as it relates to you running or your role in the community and that incident?
Absolutely. So yes, it was without question a complete tragedy. It was the most tragic day I will ever experience. It's the most tragic day that Mr. Jock's family will ever experience, and it's something that our community is continuously having to talk about and deal with. I think my experience actually going through that led to two different thoughts. One, the way that we as law enforcement officers respond to people who are suffering from addiction, suffering from mental health concerns, needs to be addressed. Like I mentioned earlier, we have to better partner with other social communities or social service communities, because I truly believe that if Mr. Jock was given the proper service and the resources to be successful, then his stars and my stars would never have aligned that night. It's something that I will always live with. It's something I think about on a daily basis, as well as his family. And if I ever had the opportunity to have a face-to-face with their family to say I'm sorry that happened, I would love that opportunity. We can do better as a community, and I think the way we do that is to get ahead of situations like this before they ever happen. We also ask our law enforcement officers to put themselves in positions where they could potentially lose their life, a partner's life, or a community member's life. And we have to have grace and understanding to when human beings are put in an unhuman scenario, we have to be understanding and not immediately rush to judgment before we actually know truly what happened. If people are intentionally going out there, and when I say people, if law enforcement is intentionally going out there to harm our community members, they absolutely deserve to be sitting in a jail cell. But we also have to be understanding that these split-second decisions that people are put into have to be met with some sort of grace and empathy. And I think that having those open conversations and that dialogue about what we can do to prevent incidences like this from happening ever again is what we need to do.
Thanks.
Absolutely.
So now, anything else that we didn't talk about that you want to bring up?
I think we covered most everything that I can think of. I really appreciate the opportunity once again. Of course, shameless plug, please visit our website, shareforsheriff.com. We have a Facebook and Instagram account as well. We're really excited about the support we've gotten, some of the endorsements we've had. We are extremely honored. I mentioned earlier Jim Porter, the National Association of Social Workers. We've received countless endorsements from local law enforcement, other community members, school board members, Parks and Rec members. So the support has been overwhelming. My family and I are unbelievably gracious to everyone and their support. And let's not forget, November 3rd is voting day, so please go out there and cast your ballots. One of the things that we're really trying to emphasize in our campaign is it's not a chip on our shoulder. We don't think Shane Nelson is a bad human being. I just think leadership has a shelf life, and we need to explore different ways of doing things. So if you agree with some of the stuff you've heard today, please cast your vote for us and support in any way you can. And thank you once again, guys.
Yeah, thanks. Regardless of the outcome, thanks for
Yeah.
taking part in our democratic process.
Yes, absolutely. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you for being here.